Aloha, brohas! I'm TheMercifulZeus, and welcome to For Your Enjoyment, where if it's worth our time, it's worth your time. Giant Sparrow's What Remains of Edith Finch is odd. That may seem like an unusual way to start a review that's generally very positive, spoiler alert, and that's because it is. If I were to play that game where you try to sum up a work in a single word, I'd certainly have some good options here. Powerful, tragic, inventive, heartfelt, even surreal. But odd might just be the one that lies at the center of it all because, honestly, it is. Good, absolutely, but, like, really odd. So, with that in mind, allow me to present, for your enjoyment, What Remains of Edith Finch. Edith Finch is an odd little duck and a whole flock of odd ducks, and it's 50-50 odds whether or not I'm talking about the game itself or our title character. For the game's part, it's an entry in a very young and still experimental genre, the exploration game, and is itself rather experimental, reminding you of familiar motifs from its fellows, but remixing them in unusual ways. It's very domestic, like Gone Home, but nowhere near as grounded. It's deep and intrinsically metaphorical, but nowhere near as hard to penetrate as Dear Esther. It's occasionally surreal and borderline fantastical, evoking Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, but lacks the part of the narrative that definitively says, yes, something weird is really going on. Edith herself is in something of a similar boat. She's in her late teens and on her own, returning to her empty childhood home for the first time in years to learn about the family story she was never told. There might be a good reason for that, though, since every story ends in a death. That isn't a spoiler, by the way. The Finch family has a real tendency to die. I suppose that's true of everyone eventually, but it's the unexpected and sometimes bizarre ways inevitability catches up to them that creates a pervasive atmosphere of death that seems to hang like leaves off the family tree. Through her journal entries, Edith will take us on a walking tour of her family home and history, each bedroom revealing the story of its former occupant and their eventual conclusion. Some are old, some are young, some unexpected, some bordering on comedic, some bittersweet and others just bitter. But far from morbid thrill-seeking, the game makes a real effort to help us understand each of these people in the short time that we spend with them. The end result is a story less concerned with death as it is with absence, with people who are here until they aren't, and with that nagging knowledge that somewhere down the line it's all going to come back to that one little title card that says year to year. It's heavy stuff, to be sure, and it's absolutely to Giant Sparrow's credit that it doesn't collapse under that weight, either by trying so hard it gets crushed by the force of trying to be meaningful over being good, or by exploring its subject matter so well that it skips right over engaging and goes straight to circling the depressing drain. Instead, the writing keeps things nimble and tactful. It wants you to meet the Finch family because their characters worth meeting for more than their endings. A big part of this is down to Edith herself. She's far from the only voice we'll hear as we make our way through the house, but she is the one making the introductions, and thankfully she's the kind of guy that's easy to spend time with. It would have been exceptionally easy for her to come across as a sarcastically emo LiveJournal user, feigning wistful wisdom beyond her years as though she's the first person to discover life is hard, and constantly being one step away from trying to insert Crawling in My Skin into the soundtrack. I might be mixing some metaphors there, but the important part is that Edith is never annoying. And considering the usual traps we've come to expect when writing for teens and pensive dramas, that in and of itself is a minor miracle. She carries scars, but she's on a real path to making peace with them if she hasn't already, as she genuinely tries to understand where she came from and what that means about where she's going. And yes, it does occasionally get a bit poetic, but, well, she is 18. When the writing does start to drift to that place, it feels both natural for the character and like a right won by the foundation that's been laid.
The woods around the house have always been uncomfortably silent, as if they're about to say something but never do.
This is equally true of any other character's words, each equally distinct and befitting who we understand them to be as a person and their lot in life.
Odin Finch buries the latest victims of the family curse.
As far as the actual physical act of your journey through the house and history goes, you should probably be able to connect the dots for yourself. I didn't make all those walking simulator comparisons just to randomly throw names around. Gone Home is probably the best analog, and not just for being set almost entirely in a house. You walk, crawl, and climb from room to room and uncover bits of backstory for both narration and set dressing, with some light environmental interaction as you find pathways around roadblocks and search for new information. Unlike Gone Home, or most of its other contemporaries, however, the flashbacks to other Finch family members take on a number of other mechanical ideas or activities beyond walking. The focus is still primarily on story over challenge, and none of these activities are really meant to engage in a pure mechanical sense as much as how they work to convey the narrative, but they're exceptionally good at accomplishing that goal. I don't want to show them off too much and ruin the surprises, but there are a couple of fascinating examples of using interactivity to communicate ideas on display here. And even when things are a bit more straightforward, they still provide a diversity and type of discovery that very few other explorational games can match. After all, the heart of the genre lies in questions like, what am I going to see next? What am I going to learn next? But very rarely do players get the opportunity to ask, what am I going to do next? It's a great demonstration that interaction doesn't inherently equal challenge, and that walking simulators can in fact be about so much more than just walking. Giant Sparrow's previous title, The Unfinished Swan, also did some really exciting work in this area, and if this is going to be a truly running trend with them, I can't wait to see what they experiment with next. If you found yourself less than convinced by past excursions into the genre for these very reasons, I can't promise that Edith Finch will sell you on the concept, but it might just make a stronger argument than its ancestors did. Now this brings us to another common criticism of indie games like this: length. This is a tricky one to navigate because in the minefield of relative opinions, the judgment call of value per dollar is a really hard one to resolve. Your time in the Finch house will probably last about 2 hours. I've seen playthrough videos that are only an hour and a half long. I'm pretty sure mine was closer to 2.5, but I really like to take my time when it comes to exploring my surroundings. For a lot of people, that'll be a deal breaker right there, and while I'm sympathetic to their reasons, at the same time, I don't know that I've ever been terribly convinced by them. Yes, it is possible to charge too much for the amount of game you get, but determining where exactly that line is drawn is far more complicated than the simple math of hours divided by dollars that a lot of people seem to want to break it down to. So while I can't exactly blame you for deciding that $20 isn't worth 2 hours, I will say that in general, I don't see it as much different from spending $20 on a DVD for a 2-hour movie. And even more importantly, it is a rock-solid 2 hours, expertly paced to last just as long as it needs to. It says exactly what needs to be said without getting dragged down in dead air to keep the runtime up, and it leaves you feeling like everything that needed to be said was said, even if you don't really want to say goodbye to the people or places it presents. This isn't just a matter of what it presents, but how it does so. Much in the way the story jumps rope with its surrealism and mundanity, the visuals constantly run a slight but sharp line between an exquisitely detailed reality and animated expression, sometimes more literally than you might expect. The house looks like a ludicrous dogpile of architecture held together by little more than magic and good intentions when you first see it, but the more time you spend inside learning how it fits together, the more its sprawl begins to organize into some kind of sense. As seems to be the case with a lot of games like this, the people look a bit more stylized than the environment, presumably because they really are just that hard to nail. With that being said, they're used sparingly and rarely feel genuinely out of place, just distinct in a way that's hard to tell exactly how intentional it was. They don't not work, but if there was a more serious criticism of the visuals to be found, it would probably lie somewhere with them. Beyond that, I encountered certain minor screen tearing issues and frame rate drops as various parts of the house loaded, or certain effects and geometry entered my field of view, but it's all very minor gripes that don't amount to enough to spoil it. This is one of those games where I'm sure I could find flaws if I really wanted to look for them. You always can, after all. But they never come out of hiding to surprise me, and I never felt the desire to hunt them down. The visual direction is expressive and approachable, modeling and texture work is some of the genre's best, the lighting is superb, superbly powerful in both its use and technical implementation, and the architecture and layout of each scene manages to communicate a lot to the player while never feeling staged or unbelievable. This is perhaps a very eccentric, possibly even structurally unsound house, but it feels like a real eccentric, questionably stable house, and I never once found it hard to believe that the people who are supposed to live there have actually lived there. All of the above extends to the more unique content in the individual stories, though again, I don't want to go into too much detail there. Sound design is a bit limited since the majority of the game takes place in an empty house and all, but it makes the most of the opportunities afforded to it, and more importantly, knows to take a bit of a back seat to the acting and the score. Take everything I said about the writing and apply it to the voices as well. Each one perfectly fits the tone set and the space that's been carved for it. These aren't necessarily big, attention-grabbing performances, but then again, these aren't big, attention-grabbing characters, and that's why it works. They're yet another perfectly polished gear in the game's clockwork, each one turning over with reliable and impressive emotional precision.
Great-Grandpa Sven built a music box for Barbara, along with the rest of the house.
Jeff Russo's score accomplishes the same feat. It's light and agile and keeps perfect step with the story's myriad oscillations. At times it'll drive what you feel for a scene, and at others it'll weave its strand into the cloth so well you won't even register that it's there. This isn't the most specifically memorable score that a game has ever had, if that specifically matters to you, but it is an expert at locking onto a tone and never letting it out of its sight. And also, as far as presentation matters go, it's a small thing to note, but one I really appreciated. This is a narration-driven game that really gets its narration. Most of Edith's interjections are very small pieces interspersed just far enough apart to make you notice their absence, and never long enough to make the airspace feel crowded. In fact, interjections isn't even the right word, since they never feel like interruptions or separate from the scene. A big part of this comes down to the way the game layers the text into the environment, creating a direct physical link between the words and the setting. And the way they animate gives an otherwise very static world some hint of fun kinetics, as well as splashing in the tiniest feeling that you're quite literally navigating the story while you navigate the house, like some strange extra dimension you're only partially aware of. If I had to find an actual criticism with any of this, after all, very few things are perfect, it would be something along the lines that the moral, for want of a much better word, on which all of this ends is a bit obvious, for want of another better word. Maybe it only feels obvious because it's hard to imagine a different way this story could possibly end than the way it does, so at least in that regard it feels earned. But I bring it up only because it struck me a tad more sharply than anything else in the narrative had up to that point. And while it wasn't enough to negatively impact it for me personally, at the same time, I could easily see someone else reserving judgment on the story on a whole until they can see where it's heading, and once all its cards are on the table, potentially finding it a bit trite. Even tired if they really aren't feeling charitable. But don't let those concerns scare you, because What Remains of Edith Finch is a fascinatingly beautiful, engagingly melancholy, passionately sincere experience, and much like the Finches themselves, I'm truly glad that I got the chance to know it, however brief a chance that may have been. So with that, my highest recommendation goes to fans of exploration games, obviously, anyone with appreciation for vaguely picaresque domestic dramas with dashes of the unusual, and anyone looking to feel just a bit delightfully sad, with special bonus points to whimsical architects. But don't sweat this one if 2 hours just isn't gonna cut it. You like proper challenge with your interaction, or you aren't in the mood for a bit of poetical tugging at the heartstrings. Developers, or those who study games, should keep an eye out for mechanical diversity that focuses purely on interaction and communication, managing multiple voices and viewpoints in writing, and various approaches to harmonize story with the environment. So that's all the time we arbitrarily have for this episode. If you like what you see, maybe drop a like or subscribe. You guys are smart people. You know how YouTube works by now. You can check out Twitter for more up-to-the-minute news and random musings, and you can check out the channel for more awesome things you might like. I am TheMercifulZeus, and this has been Giant Sparrow's What Remains of Edith Finch. For your enjoyment.